Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mex Moves, a weekly podcast where we dissect Mexican U.S. business. By we, I mean Damien Fraser. Hi, Damien. How are you?
Very well, Eduardo.
And myself, Eduardo Garcia. This week we have two quite interesting interviews. First one with Daniela Dib, talented reporter who uncovered or wrote a piece about the arrival or the expansion of a Chinese manufacturer of vehicles through a Mexican company that it's run by Cinca Inbursa and other investors, where they are very much focused on electric vehicles. She'll tell us what are they doing, what are their plans, where they want to take this new business in Mexico. And after her, we talk to Andrew Paxman, a historian who's been following and interviewing and writing books about Mexican businesses and U.S. businesses in Mexico for quite a long time, to give us a sense of the relationship in light, especially of these protests that showed a little bit of antagonism at the arrival and visit of foreigners, mainly Americans, in certain neighborhoods in Mexico. And what does that mean to the ecosystem and the relationship between the two nations? But before we go into that, we have a couple of very interesting news developments that we would like to discuss and talk about. Damien, you mentioned a recently reported transaction between McCormick that you would like to highlight.
Sure, Eduardo. So some of our listeners might have heard McCormick announced on Thursday morning that it's acquiring another 25% in its joint venture with the Mexican food company Herdez, this joint venture in Mexico, McCormick Mexico, for $750 million, bringing McCormick's stake to 75%. It was a 50-50 joint venture before, and Herdez goes down to 25%. On the face of it, this is a great deal for Herdez shareholders because the $750 million, it's about 80% of Herdez is market cap. And it will, when the deal closes next year, if it closes, it will mean that Herdez will move from a net debt to a net cash position of maybe $250 million or so, and makes, unless Herdez stock goes up a lot today, which I'm sure it will do, but at yesterday's stock price, Herdez would be trading at a sort of pro forma, sort of 4 times EV/EBITDA, so it's very, very cheap for a high margin cash generating consumer food company, although it will no longer be able to consolidate McCormick Mexico, given that it's going to have a minority interest. It's a pretty long and successful partnership. McCormick de Mexico has been selling food. They have, maybe you're familiar with it, Eduardo, as a Mexican, the McCormick mayonesa con jugo de limón, which is a top mayonnaise brand here. Do you use it? Have you used it?
Yeah, many times, Damien. It's a household name here in Mexico since I was a child, although my wife is not generally very keen on mayonnaise, whichever brand, but for elotes and many other things, we often use it, yeah.
So it went from being a kind of the mayo brand to now it's some multi-category powerhouse in Mexico. And I mean, why is McCormick doing this? They also put out a press release later on today. Speaking on Thursday, they have a conference call where they'll probably go into more details. But they're betting on Mexico, which is clearly a growing market for them, growing middle class, changing consumer habits that sort of embraces both these kind of very embedded traditional brands that have been around, since the 1940s, but they're also, open to sort of new brands and innovation. And I'm guessing that they'll, once this transaction closes, they'll invest more and bring more brands to Mexico now that they'll be consolidating and owning the 3/4 of the business. And this will make Mexico, I think, about over 20% of McCormick sales. I mean, it's not completely different to the transaction we talked about a few weeks ago with CA setting a very high price and additional stake in Ocesa to Live Nation. Its stock also reacted positively. These American giants are taking advantage of low valuations in Mexico, building up their positions here, and the Mexican companies are nonetheless setting at premiums to their depressed stock prices. So it's kind of a win-win for both sides. Herdez, a few months ago, some of you may recall, announced the spin-off of its Grupo Nutrisa, which is sort of points of sale. Cielito, Querido Café, Nutrisa itself, to be a sort of pure food business. So that's ongoing as we speak. So they're going to have spun off their retail operations. They're going to have a lot of cash, and this is presumably going to enable them to pay bigger dividends and maybe expand in their other brands not related to McCormick.
I think it's a very good sign for Mexico in the sense that a company puts its marbles in the country and speaks well in that sense. I mean, we've been a little bit negative on the foreign investment side of things, but it's not a new flow of capital. It's exchange of capital. Well, it goes to the hands of Herdez shareholders eventually, probably through dividends. But it's a bet on a country and its growing middle class or rising from poverty levels of many millions of people, as we heard a few weeks ago. So I think, in good sense, in an overall sense, it's a good news for Mexico, and I think on the valuation side, it's also positive for Herdez, and the company, which is a very interesting company, will continue to produce other foods and other processed brands that they have, and that they're quite successful in this country for years, where it faces competition from others like what is the other brand of well, there are plenty of others, so they can focus on other businesses and move ahead with them.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I think this partly reflects just the valuation arbitrage between Mexico and the US. If US food companies like McCormick are trading at double-digit kind of EV/EBITDA multiples, and Mexican ones at sort of mid-single digits, there's a kind of good trade for both sides. The Americans buy the assets in Mexico at a lower valuation than their own assets, so it's value enhancing for them, and the Mexicans still get to sell at a big premium. This is going to be, they mentioned the press release 12 times, which is sort of more than double Herdez's valuation. So McCormick said that this will be accretive to EPS and to earnings per share in year one. So that's obviously great for them, but it's also great for Herdez. So basically taking advantage of this valuation gap, just as we saw with CA or Ocesa and Live Nation a few weeks ago.
Yeah. And they still have their Mexican partners inside, so that also, I think, is important in the sense of having Mexican connections in the country, which are always needed. If you don't mind, Damien, I'll move on to the unmoving story about the Mexican banks that were highlighted by this Treasury Secretary of the United States for allegedly money laundering or having nexus with drug dealers. The Mexican government announced that the two of the three companies that were pinpointed, Intercam and CIBanco, had reached agreements with buyers for acquiring some of the assets, liabilities, loan portfolios that they have, which will probably save the jobs of the people that were working in those companies, as they have mentioned that they will incorporate them in their structure. I don't know if they'll keep them as many as they are right now because of potential duplicities, but at least it's a way out of solving what was the kiss of the death. If you ask me, when the press release came out, many of us thought that Intercam, CIBanco, and Vector were going to have a very hard time surviving that label because it came also with shutting down their potential transactions with correspondent banks in the United States. So this is a way to unload some of those assets and keep the jobs. And the way that what we've known, and there's still not a lot of details, but on one end, a fintech company called Kapital Bank, both with a K at the beginning, will be purchasing the funds, the loan portfolio, and I think some of the liabilities of Intercam, sorry, while Multiva, a brokerage firm here in Mexico tied to the family that runs hospitals and hotels, the Vasquez Raña family, will acquire the fiduciary business of CIBanco, which we even had mentioned that could have been a possibility. We thought it would be hard to untangle it from the whole operation, but it seems like they are going to be able to do so. Some of the trusts have already moved away from CIBanco, but by Multiva coming in, maybe they'll be able to save a lot of that business and incorporate it into their own trust fund structure. I read this morning that division will grow from 1% of the market to 27% of the market by this acquisition. And on the other hand, as this announcement was made a day or a few days later, the U.S. also postponed the final date when U.S. banks allegedly were not supposed to do any transactions with these institutions. I heard that stopped the moment the press release came out, but at least it gives a sense that the U.S. is giving time for the Mexican authorities and the owners of these institutions to find a way to solve the issue as quietly or as beneficial as possible for the system and for those that work in those institutions, as well as for shareholders. Who knows how much they are going to be able to recover, because they'll still keep some of the problems and they will have to pay back a few of those elements, I guess. But things are moving after the shock, and maybe they will be able to, the waters will be able to calm down a little bit, and we'll have to wait and see how this finally is resolved. What's your take, Damien?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Intercam is a lot larger than Kapital with a K. According to the data reported in Whitepaper, Kapital much smaller than Intercam. We don't know exactly what percentage of Intercam Kapital will be buying, but Kapital had a 9 billion peso loan book versus Kapital's 25 billion loan book, and Intercam was very, very profitable, $70 million of profits last year. So this could be very transformational for Kapital. Eduardo, Kapital was founded about 5 years ago. It was originally a pure fintech, and then it bought a bank, Autofin, and so it's one of the few kind of fintechs that actually has a bank. Although I think the final authorization is still pending, but they're operating as a combined entity. And Kapital's been very focused on developing a kind of ERP, a database to help and dashboard to help pymes, SMEs in Mexico, so manage their finances. And it gives them this kind of dashboard to help them have much more clarity and transparency on their cash flows, and then lend them money should they need it. And for Kapital, it helps make better lending decisions because they have access to the data of the pyme. It's got backing from a big San Francisco VC fund, which is also quite focused on AI and data in the financial sector, called Tribe. I think they gave them about $40 million of equity back in December 2023, and a $125 million credit facility. And so they're effectively in the space similar to the space of Confio, which is also an SME lender, but obviously doesn't have a banking license. A little bit similar to Clara, which is more focused on credit cards and expense management, and Covalto. But this puts them into a much bigger league, and it will, I assume, be able to, apply their AI and their technological tools to the customers that they're acquiring from this Intercam transaction if it gets confirmed.
Yeah, they also announced the day later that they were going to inject $100 million in their capital structure to make sure that the clients from Intercam have confidence when they're moved to the new bank. So seems that they do have the backing and the resources to make this acquisition of some of the assets of Intercam Fondos, Intercam Casa de Cambio, and Intercam Banco work for their model. And they're also bringing in the people that operated Intercam. Now, I guess the foreign exchange element is not part of the deal because that's what it's been sanctioned by the U.S. authorities. So that will remain in the current owners of Intercam, and they'll have to deal with that in a certain way or form. But it's trying to put the best face of something that was originally very troublesome, that these three institutions were gonna, or they will still probably have to be liquidated, but they were gonna fail. And this at least allows them to solve and sell some of the things that are worth savaging and handing them to other people to run them and operate them profitable and for the benefit of the system overall.
That's right. And talking about banking, Eduardo, I don't know if you saw the news that Nu has changed its country manager. Armando Herrera, who was in fact at Confio, has been named the local CEO, and Ivan Canales, who's been the country manager for, I think, about 7 years, is moving on. Interesting development in the sense that Nu has obviously been hugely successful in clients. It's got 12 million clients in Mexico. It's built up a massive deposit base by offering attractive yields. But it's also, I think, had perhaps slightly negative sort of credit origination. It's has, in the second quarter, it reported an adjusted sort of net interest margin of negative $35 million, basically adjusted for write-offs, and their write-offs plus the NPLs are over 20% of their credit portfolio. And in the first quarter, they also lost about $30 million. So it's a combination of these high yields on the deposits and the poor credit quality so far. So by bringing in Armando, my guess is the focus is going to be more on making sure that their credit origination is disciplined. He I think was for a decade maybe at Amex, and then maybe 5 years at Confio. He doesn't have a lot of, as far as I can tell, a lot of experience on the deposit side, and he doesn't have a lot of experience on the mass market credit side, because Amex is obviously much more high end. But he does have experience in SME lending, and generally coming from especially Amex, a company with very strong corporate governance that will come in handy as Nu becomes a bank in Mexico. And we'll see where it takes it, but they're obviously going to be are a major player in terms of clients, but going to be a major player in terms of loan book and revenues and profits once they get the bank license and start offering more products beyond the credit card, which is they now have, and the deposit accounts that they have. In fact, in the second quarter conference call, Nu said that personal loans in Mexico could be even bigger than the credit cards. So they clearly continue to put money to play in Mexico. The July numbers just came out for Nu, and their credit growth is picking up. They have a sort of strange problem, which they have 5 times more deposits than credit, which is a drag on profitability because they're obviously still paying over CETES on average for their deposits. So I think the market will welcome that the credit growth is picking up as long as they can control the credit quality. And the NPLs came down a bit also in July, although you'd have to look at the write-off numbers in order to make sense of the non-performing loans, because you could obviously bring down NPLs by just increasing write-offs. But and they've also quite significantly brought down the deposit yields. As you probably remember, they were offering sort of 15% across the board a year ago, and now with CETES rates coming down, they're continuously bringing down rates. So that will also help them. So they may be at an inflection point, and bringing in Armando may be a sort of a sign that they're going to now focus, on continuing to grow the business, but also ensuring that there's tight discipline when it comes to credit origination.
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone with fintech and non-fintech background comes in at a crucial time, and I think it does show that sometimes old experience could also help or put things on a more down to earth perspective or basis for a new model to be successful. So it's an interesting move, and we'll have to wait and see how Nu does here in Mexico. And if you don't mind, Damien, there was an interesting piece of information about a Mexican truck, electric Mexican truck, Taruk, produced by a company called Megaflux back in Ciudad Sagun, where with Dina, the famous oil pulse maker. I'm sure you remember that company, Damien. That was on the news quite a lot back in the 90s, or the beginning of this century. And this new bus apparently is going to go all the way to LA. We couldn't confirm the information, but it's an interesting development. It's a Mexican company that basically imports a lot of parts from China to produce these electric trucks. And it's been backed heavily by the Mexican government as one of those industries that could be beneficial for Mexico's growth prospects, as it's engaged in a new technology, and a bit similar to what we're going to hear from Daniela Dib on the other Mexican company that is producing electric vehicles, JAC. But this one, it's interesting because it's trying to sell in the United States, or at least they got a call from someone in the United States to export their technology and their trucks. We'll have to wait and see if that doesn't generate any ripples with the U.S. government and its anti-Chinese rhetoric, because it has a lot of parts from China. But again, technology, new technology coming or being developed in Mexico for local and foreign consumption. I think that's also quite positive for the country.
Yeah, I'm a bit more skeptical than you, Eduardo. I mean, I think their current production is about 2,000 units per year. So fulfilling an order of 20,000 buses, which is what Marcelo Ebrard claimed, seems not viable unless they invest a lot of money in boosting production. And wouldn't be the first time that the Mexican government has made ambitious announcements about Mexican cars and bus productions at the local level, which haven't panned out. I don't know anyone who's seen any of these buses right now. The Taruk buses in Mexico. Supposedly there are sort of pilot programs in different parts of the country, but at least I'm not aware of anyone who's aware of these trucks. Supposedly there was 20 units requested by Puebla for tourist zones, and then another fleet headed to Ensenada, but it's tiny. And then if it's true that it's mostly Chinese parts, I'm happy to learn more. if anyone's listening to this, then they might not meet the 75% TMEC national content rule to be exported tariff-free to the US. And so they would end up paying quite high tariffs for their exports. And even if they do meet the TMEC regional content rules, cars are right now still paying tariffs. Car parts are largely exempt if they meet the content rules. So even if they meet the rules, there's still quite significant tariffs. So we'll have to see if they have the production capacity to meet these orders, and then we'll also have to see whether the quality of the product is good enough to satisfy the U.S. market or the Mexican market for that matter.
That is correct, and we haven't seen it. I think they sent a few units also to Baja California, so I guess as time goes by, we'll be able to see them maybe on the roads in Mexico City, or when we travel to other cities in the country.
You probably remember Linea, right? That other Mexican sort of e-mobility project that didn't pan out.
That's right. Yeah, that's supposed to come out before the World Cup, no? Or no, in a few months, I guess. We'll have to.
Yeah, but we don't read much about it anymore, do we?
But every now and then it gets mentioned, so we'll have to wait and see. But if you don't have anything else, Damien, what about if we move on to our two interviews for this weekly podcast? Hi, we have today with us Daniela Dib, who is a reporter and a brilliant journalist who just wrote a great piece on JAC Motors, the company that manufactures vehicles here in Mexico. Danny, tell us what you found out, why is different from other stories. This was published in Whitepaper, obviously. So please let us know, Danny.
Thank you, Eduardo, and hi, Damien. Thanks for inviting me to your podcast to talk about this story. So, yes, René and I interviewed Isidoro Masri, who is the CEO of Giant Motors Latin America, which is the company that manufactures JAC vehicles in Mexico. And we were quite intrigued about their business model because it's very different to any other company that assembles cars in Mexico. As we all know, Mexico has a very long story of automotive manufacturing in various parts of the country. There's Volkswagen in Puebla, there's the Nissan plants and the Kia plants in El Bajío. There's also a lot of tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers spread out all across the country. And it's basically the same business model everywhere. These factories are owned by the headquarters in wherever countries these companies are, from Japan or from France or from Europe or the US. And they own their location here, and the sales goals and the production goals are all determined outside of Mexico, and they all add up to their global production and sales numbers. And what we found out with JAC and Giant Motors Latin America is that it is a Mexican company that basically just acquired the blueprints to manufacture all of the JAC vehicles. They assemble 22 models in the country. But the owners are Mexican, the investors are Mexican, and it's quite like an interesting and different way of structuring a company. The company is owned by 49% by Inbursa, which is owned by Grupo Carso, and the rest is, I believe it's 3% from the family, the Masri family. Isidoro is, like I said, the CEO, but his father Elias is the co-founder. And they have like a large history in electronics manufacturing. And then they found the opportunity to start assembling these cars nationally. And then they added some other investors to build this company and just operate like a local company that doesn't have to report sales to a headquarters outside. So that we thought that was fascinating. And they were kind enough to grant us the interview and explain a little bit more of the strategy they are trying to build in Mexico. Over 9,600 vehicles they have assembled since 2016. They have sold more than 80%. They don't export anything. They say that they are meant to just attend to the local Mexican market. They have no intention of exporting. And they are very careful to listen what their consumers in Mexico want to buy. I think something they have made like a very smart move is they anticipated to this whole movement that very large companies like Bimbo or FEMSA are trying to do to electrify their fleets. So they basically sell some of their best of their like vehicles that they made specifically for Mexico in terms of like cargo vehicles. They sold like 7,000 to Bimbo, and they helped them develop their electric chargers for electrifying their fleet. So yeah, that was a great part of the story, because I've been following the electric vehicle industry for a while, and I think corporate vehicles, or what they call commercial vehicles, are like a very good option for distributing these cars instead of just like passenger cars that are sometimes harder to charge because there's no infrastructure or infrastructure to start charging them.
It's a fascinating story, without a doubt, Danny. Tell me one thing. So, are the parts of these vehicles produced in Mexico as well, or are they imported? And so basically, they're buying the patents of the vehicles, and then they have the instructions for how to assemble one car, and they come up with their own way of supplying the vehicles or their manufacturing plant so that they can build the cars. Is that how it works?
Yes, basically that's it. When they met the JAC people back in China, they were trying to find a company that they could assemble in Mexico with imported auto parts. And what they wanted was the flexibility to make their own decisions. And what they told us is that JAC and the JAC team was the only one that was suitable to what they were trying to build here. So yes, responding directly to your question, they basically get all of the instructions of how to build a JAC car from China, and then they bring it to Mexico. They import some of the parts to start producing them here. But something interesting that Isidoro told us is that nowadays almost 30% of their tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers are from Mexico. And it makes sense because, like I said, Mexico is it has like a very strong automotive industry. So there are already people here who maybe they don't make the engine or something that's very specific and trademarked by the company, but all of these other things that are needed to produce a car, they are trying to grow their local suppliers. So yeah, I think it's a stretch to say that it is a car, like a Mexican car, but it definitely is a Mexican company that is making the most out of the local talents and things that they do best in order to engage in this type of very peculiar business model.
It's very interesting. And I guess at some point they might be able, after gaining all this technological knowledge, to modify or even create their own design vehicle, or do they have an agreement that they only can produce under the JAC brand?
As far as I understand, they started first assembling some parts of the FAW vehicles before they started to assemble the JAC cars. And so they have meddled into fabricating or producing cars from other companies. But I don't think it's in their interest to produce their own car, because it's quite a competitive market. If the Chinese know that electric cars, they are the best in doing them, to make them affordable and to make them quite reliable and sturdy for a market that like Mexico. I don't think they are trying to get into producing their own car. They are just trying to listen to their Mexican consumers. And something interesting they also said is that of the 13 electric vehicles that they produce, 3 of them are only sold in Mexico. So were basically tailor-made for the Mexican market, considering the charging needs or the charging infrastructure, or even the state of the road, or how often they need to take care of the car. So they are listening to the local market, but I don't think they will meddle into just like building one.
How are they doing in terms of market share, Danny? I understand they have some big corporate clients like Bimbo. Are they doing well from a consumer's perspective?
Yes, they stressed a lot, and this is what these companies will always say, that they don't really care about market share, that they want to bring the customer the best experience that they can have. But they seem to have almost 30% of the electric vehicle market. They, considering that they have only produced 96,000 cars in the almost 10 years that they have been making them, it's a tiny sliver of the entire automotive market in Mexico. It represents less than 1%. But when you look into the electric cars, they do have like a significant share. I don't know if you have seen these vans or like cargo trucks, and they are used mostly for last mile deliveries. And they are, I think there's like a correlation between the explosion of all of these logistics industry, and the JAC vans seem tailor-made for that type of purpose.
And they're increasing production, right? Right now.
Yes, a couple of months ago, they announced that they invested several $1 million to expand their factory, which is in Ciudad Sagún, Hidalgo, where the old factory of the Dina buses was. And they are trying to duplicate the production in the next 2 years. So they are, seeing these numbers, they are having a good reception among the local market. And yeah, let's see what happens next.
Terrific. Danny, that's super interesting. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll keep close tabs on what's going on here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. Great to see you.
Today on Mex Moves, we're exploring the history behind US-Mexico business ties with historian and biographer Andrew Paxman, a fellow Brit like me, and a former colleague of Eduardo's at the Mexico City News. Andrew is a professor at the CIDE University based in Aguascalientes. He's written books on the American tycoon, William Jenkins, who made his fortune in Mexico from the turn of the century to the 1960s in real estate, sugar, banking, and then, of course, in cinema. He wrote an acclaimed biography of Emilio Escarga Milmo, who the father of the current Emilio Escarga, who turned Televisa into the Spanish language largest media company. And he's also written on Carlos Slim, Mexico's richest man, all looking at how their fortunes were built and their relationship with the Mexican government of the day and the Mexican state of the day. I think if there's a common theme in all of Andrew's writings, it's the intersection of Mexican business, politics, and media, and often, as you see with Jenkins and Escarga and Slim to a lesser extent, how that interacts with American business interest in Mexico. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Damien.
So why don't we kick off with these anti-gentrification protests in Mexico City? And some people are interpreting them as also anti-American protests. And certainly there's graffiti in Condesa and Roma that I'm sure you've seen about gringos going home. Mm-hmm. How do you put that in a historical perspective? How does this compare to previous reactions to sort of heavy US presence in Mexico or heavy kind of Mexico interference in Mexican affairs? Is this something unusual or pretty standard from a historical perspective?
I think it's fairly unusual in terms of the way that public protest against the United States or US influence has played out in recent memory, let's say. So during the Cold War, there were, particularly during the 1960s, there were frequent street protests, often led by students, against the United States, but they focused on U.S. foreign policy. So, for example, one of the popular cries of student protesters in the 1960s was "Yankees no, Cuba sí." In other words, the protest was against the U.S. embargo on Cuba and the U.S. opposition to the Cuban Revolution, its attempts to undermine Fidel Castro. That kind of protest is probably the most recent public protest en masse, let's say, prior to this one. During the 1990s, during the debates about the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eventually went into effect in 1994, I don't recall there being street protests. Going further back in time, there were, however, localized protests against the American presence in, for example, areas where there was a strong U.S. investment in oil or in the mines, where American investors were considered to be throwing their weight around, not treating Mexican employees equally to American employees, paying them less. And sometimes these would result in localized protests. But that's quite some time ago now.
Andrew, do you think, given this background that you just gave us, where you are essentially saying that it hasn't been that prevalent, that the changes within this last two governments, I mean, the previous one and this one, that are a little bit more or are left-leaning, represents a break from that good relation that we've had before with the U.S.?
I think it does to a point, although I think one has to distinguish between a relationship with the country, with Americans in general, and perception of the U.S. government. So, for example, I would say that NAFTA, which I mentioned earlier, goes into effect in 1994. It has the result of bringing the two countries together in unexpected ways. It's not simply a trade and investment agreement, which brings more, a greater U.S. presence into Mexico. It also has the unexpected, or at least unforeseen by the Mexican government, result of impoverishing millions of Mexican farmers who can no longer compete with subsidized U.S. corn. That prompts massive migration, undocumented migration to the U.S. And that migration becomes somewhat circular. So the 500,000 up to 1 million Mexicans who are crossing the border a year in the 1990s begin after a while to come home and then go back. And so there develops a kind of circular migration. And as people are coming back from the US and recounting their experiences to their families, they are telling them that Uncle Sam is not the great antichrist that the Mexican left had warned them about, that it's actually, the United States is actually an open and welcoming country by and large. That, coupled with increasing tourism to the United States by the Mexican middle class, I think generally brings the two countries closer together. That said, in 2003, when George Bush decides to invade Iraq, there is a widespread rejection of that. Mexico has a tradition of rejecting any kind of foreign intervention, having been intervened upon so often in its own history. And so the perception of the US government did change in the Bush years. It recovered under Obama, and then the perception of Trump was very negative as of 2015, when he began campaigning for president and dismissed Mexican migrants as rapists and murderers. So if you were to chart, this has been charted. Public opinion surveys on the U.S. presidents have risen and fallen or the popularity of those presidents has risen and fallen according to the incumbent. But the more general perception of the United States has remained pretty positive. That, to take up your particular question about the recent governments, I think that because anti-Americanism, at least in the last 100 years, since the Mexican Revolution, has been more the province of the left than the right, which is quite different, by the way, to the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was the conservatives who tended to be anti-American. But in the last 100 years, it's more been a province of the left, anti-Americanism. And so I think what has happened is that the last two governments since 2018, while the presidents themselves, López Obrador and Sheinbaum, have not indulged in anti-American rhetoric, there are many traditional leftists in their coterie, in their government, and leftist sympathizers at, for example, at the big public universities, who I think have felt a greater license to use anti-American rhetoric in their own columns, for example, in newspapers, or their pronouncements on, as YouTubers, let's say, and so that has probably fed into these protests against gentrification in Mexico City.
Yeah, because I mean, we should not make a big storm out of just one protest. Am I right, or are we right to say that it's an important signal of anti-Americanism of what we saw in Condesa a few days ago? Or is it more of a reaction to high rents and things like that?
That's a really good question. And this is a question that has been engaging historians for some time. So, for example, during the Mexican Revolution, there were a lot of seizures of American property, big haciendas. By one calculation, in 1910, when the revolution broke out, 23% of the surface area of Mexico was foreign owned. Often through prestanombres, often through straw men who were Mexicans, but there was a great American presence. So William Randolph Hearst famously owned a huge chunk of the state of Chihuahua, and a lot of these lands were seized. And some historians have argued, this is evidence of anti-Americanism, and others have argued, no, it's really evidence of anti-latifundismo. It was a general resentment of the large estates in the hands of a few, and it just happened to be the case that a number of them were owned by Americans. And one could probably debate these protests in Mexico City in a similar fashion. To what extent is it anti-Americanism, and to what extent is it really a more general protest against outside ownership of or the ownership, the growing ownership by the wealthy of real estate in places like Condesa and Roma, very often owned by, I would imagine typically owned by Mexicans, but leased out to American digital nomads and Airbnb and so forth. So I would say it's probably a mix. It's probably a mix of but the anti-American element makes the better story, you might say, and so that's what's being picked up upon by the U.S. media.
Do you think, Andrew, AMLO seemed to me to be more anti-Spanish than anti-American?
I think that's a really good point. Yes. And it's a great irony because his mother's family was Spanish. And he got his start in life in a small town in Tabasco. When he grew up in the 1950s, most of the children he went to school with left school at 12 or 14 and became farmers or fishermen. He was from one of the wealthier families in that town, thanks to his mother. His father was very poor, but his mother's family were Spanish immigrants who did very well. They were merchants, shop owners. And so his ability to get an education and eventually a university education owed greatly to his Spanish heritage, you might say. But starting in the 1970s, he began to sympathize, having been a student at the UNAM, having come under the influence of a famous Tabascan poet called Carlos Pellicer, who was a great sympathizer with Mexico's indigenous population. He began to see the marginalization of Mexico's indigenous population as the result of the Spanish conquest and Spanish landowning over several centuries. And I think in the early 2000s, when he was widowed and he married his second wife, Beatriz Gutierrez Mula, her work as an academic deals a lot with the conquest and the ravages of the conquest. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that her view of history is pretty, views the Spanish as villains in Mexican history, and we see that element, that point of view, entering AMLO's public pronouncements early on in the sexennial. 2019, 2020, he's starting to talk in his morning press conferences about the travesty of the conquest, and he's also making gestures towards Spain that are pretty aggressive in terms of diplomatic relations.
And do you think that's reflecting a sort of this ideological viewpoint, or do you think it's partly because he couldn't afford to take on America, given that 85% of Mexico's exports go to America, whereas he could easily take on Spain? So he, to some extent,
Spain becomes a convenient villain. Yes, indeed, a much more convenient villain than the United States. Right. Yes,
because he picked a fight with Iberdrola. He didn't pick a fight with Walmart, right?
No. He is a pragmatist. He's a curious combination of idealist and pragmatist. And I think in economic policy and in international affairs. He has not just Spain. He has been dismissive of the European Union too, and he hasn't employed the kind of anti-American rhetoric that I might have expected him to employ when he was running for president. So yes, I think that's it. Spain is the convenient villain.
Stepping aside from the leaders, what's your sense of the business relationship? I mean, Mexican companies have invested in American companies have invested in Mexico. Mexicans love U.S. brands like Starbucks and Domino's,
right,
McDonald's, and you name it. And Americans are now loving tacos and Mexican chips and tortillas. Are we seeing a more integration between the two countries with all its caveats? Because, and I want to talk about this a little bit further, of these invasion threats or intervention threats or whatever.
I think we are seeing ever greater integration, but I think it's also important to recognize that this integration has a long history. So you have an initial influx of American investment, particularly in mining and in railroads, starting in the 1870s. Then the oil sector. This is some of that flees Mexico during the revolution. But then in the 1920s, you have this curious mix where, on the one hand, the rhetoric of the government is very nationalistic, and the government is expropriating large land holdings, many of them American-owned. But at the same time, it is opening its doors to new American investors, particularly manufacturers. So Ford comes in 1924, General Motors comes in 1932, Colgate Palmolive come in the 1940s, and so the idea of or the presence of American products, American brands in Mexico is it goes back a long way, and it sort of increases incrementally. So in 1941, just before both the US and Mexico get involved in World War II, but in the context of a wartime environment, Mexico comes up with a foreign investment law that says foreign companies, and they're really thinking above all of Americans, foreign companies are very welcome to come into Mexico as investors as long as they choose a Mexican partner, and 51% of the investment needs to be in the hands of Mexicans. This remains law until NAFTA. It's important to remember that NAFTA, while it was called the Free Trade Agreement, was really an investment agreement more than anything else. So once NAFTA goes into effect, American investors no longer need to seek Mexican partners. Some had already managed to come in on their own because they got exemptions from this 1941 law. But you have this long tradition of consumption of American goods going back to the 1920s. And yes, it's become more prevalent since NAFTA, I would say since the early 90s, because a lot of American companies came into Mexico in the early 90s believing that NAFTA was a done deal even before it was signed. So the big franchises like McDonald's, I believe the first McDonald's opened in the Zona Rosa in 1990. I think I got that date right. And then American multiplex theaters were coming in again in 93. I think it was the first one, again before NAFTA goes into effect. So you have a mushrooming presence since the 1990s.
Is that in any way, shape, or form under threat, not just by what you said, the lefty elements of the new governments, but of Trump's threats of going after the drug cartels in Mexican territory without its permission?
I think there are degrees of threat that come and go. So when I think it was 2016, around that time of Trump's election, the first time around, Ford had announced it was going to open a new plant, I think in Silao, somewhere in one.
San Luis Potosí.
Oh, was it San Luis Potosí? That's it. And they cancelled it. and they cancelled it in response to this, Trump's rhetoric about Mexico as being a threat to the health of U.S. business, and the health and the welfare of the American worker. So I think occasionally what happens when the political rhetoric heats up, a few companies will get cold feet, but I think they are a small minority.
Any concerns that it would go further?
I don't think so, because it's ultimately not good. For one thing, it's not good for the U.S. consumer. And secondly, so many industries are highly integrated. The automotive industry is the classic example of this. There are so many auto parts made in different countries that cross the border perhaps several times before a car is finished and goes on sale. So to disentangle all that is very, very complex. It's easy to make declarations about Mexican manufacturing being a threat to U.S. manufacturing, but it's hard to disentangle it.
Right, and that's why, in that sense, Andrés Manuel was opposed to the treaty, but now that the treaty has been in place for 30 years or more, is a pragmatism in that sense, although in others he might not be as pragmatical as.
And Trump was the same, but Trump on the campaign trail in 2016 made noises about scrapping NAFTA, but ultimately he decided, no, we're going to tweak it instead, and we'll give it a different name, so it sounds a bigger change than it actually is.
Looking at your biographies of William Jenkins, Emilio Escarga, Carlos Slim, and even your upcoming book on AMLO, what role do you think, with respect to the businessman, what role do you think American capital and their understanding of American capital kind of played a part in their business success?
Well, Jenkins, the book you've kindly mentioned is called Jenkins of Mexico, and I chose that title deliberately because he was an American who came to Mexico and became of Mexico. He never adopted a Mexican citizenship, but he made Mexico his home, and he did not repatriate profits. So in that sense, he's a bit of a sui generis character, but he does his life, the story of his life, does shed a lot of light on U.S.-Mexican relations, on the way that sometimes Americans are vilified for political purposes by revolutionary governments or during the Cold War. It also sheds light on the practice, which really goes back to the 19th century, of what we might generally describe as crony capitalism. In other words, how frequently entrepreneurs in Mexico have had to get into bed with politicians. They've had to, at the very least, seek political protection, particularly after the revolution. New constitution that comes out of the revolution, the 1917 constitution, represents quite a threat to foreign investment in Mexico. Of course, it's subject to interpretation and to new laws being made on the basis of that constitution. But in that context, Jenkins, and not just Jenkins, but many investors coming into Mexico after the revolution, seek out political partners or political protectors. And sometimes that means giving them, making contributions to their political campaigns. Jenkins does this in Puebla in 1936. When Maximino Avila Camacho runs for governor, Jenkins becomes his main campaign financier, or offering them covert stakes in their companies. More recently, we saw something similar. There was a famous episode in 1993 when it was revealed that Carlos Salinas, the president of Mexico at the time, had convened a dinner with 29 or 30 billionaires or near billionaires, and asked them for $25 million each for the campaign funds of the ruling party at the time, the PRI. And this was widely interpreted, again, within the context of crony capitalism, an implicit exchange of favors. If you cough up for these campaign funds, we will ensure that you carry on getting favorable contracts and concessions and treatment from the tax authorities. So this, I think, is something that when Americans are coming to Mexico to invest in Mexico, I think they need to be aware of this context, this context of very close relations between business and political elites. Now, that said, I think it's also really important for American investors, American business people to be aware of how that interdependence with the state varies quite a bit according to where you are in the country. So Monterrey has a tradition of entrepreneurialism apart from the state. They perhaps exaggerate a little how independent they are, but the tradition in Monterrey has been to build up big businesses without government contracts, without great political protections. So the self-image of the Monterrey business elite is as we are the great entrepreneurs of Mexico. You see something of that in Guadalajara too. In Mexico City, on the other hand, the tradition has been much more one of proximity to the political elite. Puebla, I would say, is also pretty dependent on political relations, or at least historically so.
Andrew, and going back to our days when we met at the news, what's your sense of how things have moved between Mexico and the U.S. business communities politically? I mean, we got together with the U.S. through NAFTA. Trump is back with a very different approach towards the world and free trade. And what do you make of this 30 long year that you've seen Mexico change and evolve?
I think it's been 30 years of increasing understanding, increasing mutual understanding, and a deeper mutual understanding. I mentioned earlier how migrants have gone to the US and come back, and their circular migration has contributed to a greater understanding among what we might call the working class. But among the more educated Mexicans and Americans, there is also grown a greater understanding, thanks in large part, I would say, to the press. And you see this on both sides. So on the Mexican side, what was and remains the main business magazine in Mexico, called Expansión. It was founded in the late 1960s, and it basically, for about 25 years, it published puff pieces on Mexican business elites. But starting in the mid-90s, it went through a change of ownership and began to engage in more in-depth business reporting. Then you had Reforma, the newspaper Reforma, launching in Mexico City in 1993. Its business section, again, quite distinct from most Mexican business sections, did not publish press releases as stories. It actually took a more investigative approach or questioning approach to business activities. Your own initiative, Eduardo, in 2003, Sentido Común, that again helped generate a more sophisticated coverage of business activity and economics in Mexico. And then on the other side, you have, and again, I know that you were intimately involved in this, you have Bloomberg coming into Mexico in the mid-90s. You have the Wall Street Journal expanding its presence. The reporting on business in Mexico by international media becomes more sophisticated as of the early 90s. There had already been quite a big presence of foreign media dating from the 80s, because in the 1980s, during the time of civil wars in Central America, many bureau had folk who were based in Mexico City, who would then go into El Salvador and so forth and report. But that emphasis on political reporting in the foreign media in the 80s transforms into an emphasis on economic reporting starting around 1990. And so specialists are brought in by the Wall Street Journal, by the New York Times and other media who are able to better report on the changing business landscape, which of course dovetails very well with NAFTA, the talks and the entering into effect of NAFTA. So I think people reading the media on both sides of the border have gained a better understanding of each other's countries.
Well, I'm sure this is an evolving story, Andrew, and we will probably need to continue talking of what we see and what we don't see and how things change, because nothing is set in stone, but I think it's been quite interesting to speak to you. Thank you for your time and perspective on these very interesting topics that will continue to raise our interest, and hopefully we can chat again.
Thank you. Thank you, Eduardo. Just as a final note, for Americans who are interested in reading about Mexico, in a sort of a long view of Mexico, you'll recall that back in the early 90s, Americans would come to Mexico with what was then known as the Bible, Distant Neighbors by Alan Riding. It's still a great book. It holds up very well. But more recent books, a couple of more recent books that I would recommend are Opening Mexico by Sam Dillon and Julia Preston, and Mexico, Democracy Interrupted by Joe Tuckman, which give a very good guide to what's been going on in at least up until 2012. And for what's been going on under Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the current government, there is a center-left publication called Dissent that has done some very good sympathetic but also critical reporting on long-form reporting on the Morena governments, written by Humberto Beck and Patrick Eiber.
Great recommendations. That's great, and we're anxious to read you in your AMLO book that will come out hopefully in the not-too-distant future.
Yes, the Spanish edition will come out, I hope, in the spring.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Andrew.
You're most welcome.
Terrific. So thank you for joining Next Moves. Please subscribe and hope you join us next week.
Good.